Here are Alex O'Connor and Trent Horn debating why God lets people be atheists.
Do you think it's possible that the reason I believe in God, even though, well, you would say it's highly probable God does not exist?
I wouldn't know how to put a number on the probability of God's existence or non-existence because I don't understand what a God is, so I don't know how to make estimates about one's existence. I also wouldn't be able to quantify my belief or non-belief in such an entity. It would be like a divide by zero error.
Would be your view?
Highly probable is putting it a bit
Probable,
strongly.
more than 51%.
I would say I kind of lean towards it. I'm always suspicious of putting numbers on credence to beliefs. I think, what does it mean to kind of believe something 20%? Like, I don't really know what this means, but...
I think it would be easier to put a number on how much I believe in something than to put a number on the probability of the existence of something that is not recognizably coherent to me.
I certainly lean more towards strong atheism, but I wouldn't be able to put a number on it.
So what I would say is, if you're asking me, what do I think you've done wrong? It'd probably be the same answer you would give me as to why I have a misplaced confidence God does exist. I have made, there's different reasons why people believe or don't believe. And I think it's possible smart people can fail to believe certain things because they make certain cognitive errors. It's not necessarily a moral error.
Well, if God exists and someone makes the cognitive error of inferring that he does not exist, why would such a person be punished if it's not a moral error? If a person is simply mistaken about God not existing, why does that alone seem to disqualify them from heaven?
But we find certain intuitions more plausible than others. We make different inferences. We have different values of different kinds of evidences that are presented. And we look at the world in different ways. So, for example, when you look out into nature, and you see the evil, the suffering, nature red in tooth and claw, human suffering, I see that, but I also see other strange things. I see a moral obligation to help people, and not just people, but a moral obligation to help non-humans not suffer.
How exactly do you see this obligation? Can you draw a picture of it? Can you photograph this obligation? I suspect that you don't literally see this obligation. Rather, I think you feel it emotionally. I feel an urge to stop both human and non-human suffering as well. But I recognize that because it is an emotional intuition, it is an aspect of myself, not an empirical observation of the world. Sometimes apologists will argue that because we feel the urge to help non-human animals, and sometimes even do so at the expense of resources that humans could be spending on themselves or each other, that it can't be the product of evolution. That would only be the case, however, if evolution produced only absolute advantages. It doesn't. It often produces net advantages. Some features produced by evolution have both advantages and disadvantages, but as long as the disadvantages don't outweigh the advantages, natural selection will preserve such features. It may be the case that having too much empathy is still more effective at keeping the species from going extinct than having too little.
As if I have this command to do that. Though I do see that the humans who suffer have a dignity and a value that the animals do not. And I see hope and virtues. I see other things in there that make me look at the picture in a different way, if that makes sense.
But of course, it's different. Because from an atheistic paradigm, I wouldn't expect that everybody who honestly seeks the truth will find it. Like on an atheistic paradigm, people can very easily seek for the truth and just get it wrong. Mm-hmm. There's no guiding principle here. There's nobody who is there to catch you where you go wrong. On Christianity, if somebody goes honestly wrong, you'd expect them to be guided to the truth.
If the consequences of not believing in God is eternal torment, it's hard to see how an all-loving and all-powerful God would let that happen to someone accidentally.
Because there's a God who wants to come to know this person, and they've gone wrong through no fault of their own. This is why Schellenberg shifts from, he used to talk about, originally the argument was formulated in terms of reasonable and non-reasonable disbelief. He swapped to saying resistant and non-resistant unbelief, because these are two different things. You can reasonably believe a falsehood, and on atheism, you can non-resistantly believe falsehoods. There's no problem with this. Of course, you can be open to something being true and just not be convinced of it. There's no problem with this. But if you believe that there's somebody overseeing this who will look at people who are honestly seeking and they go wrong, and just somehow allows them to go wrong, because it would be so easy to fix. Most people who come to Christianity do not do so because they've read a syllogism in a book somewhere. If you ask a friend who's a Christian what their conversion story is, if they weren't a Christian all their life, it's incredibly rare that you find somebody saying that they read a particular argument and they just suddenly drop to their knees. Rather, it's usually something more experiential. Maybe the arguments that they're reading inform something that they've experienced, or maybe they have an experience that is informed by things that they've read, sure, but it's the experience, it's that feeling that actually causes somebody to convert. So for somebody who's non-resistantly non-believing, all it would take is a sign. All it would take is an experience that this person can interpret as a religious experience. And that's all I'm looking for here.
I have no idea what such an experience would be like. I can't even imagine such a thing. So even if I had such an experience, I don't think I would even know how to interpret any experience as such.
And so in other words, you say, well, I'm saying to you, isn't there a problem that people non-resistantly don't believe in Christianity? And you're saying, well, it's the same as me, non-resistantly not believing in atheism.
Right.
Two things.
Because you
Firstly,
believe there's no God of atheism that could set me straight, but there is a God in Christianity that could set people straight.
Not only that, but there's another asymmetry, which is that I'm an atheist, you're a Christian.
Mm.
I want to be a Christian.
Mm.
You don't want to be an atheist, presumably.
I want the truth, and at this point in my life, I'm highly convinced atheism is not that thing. So you're right, it's not something I'm trying to actively ascertain. But I think then, so the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene?
Well, especially given the stakes of being in error about his non-existence. If hell did not exist, then I could see an all-powerful and omnibenevolent God simply not caring whether people believe in him or not. But if he truly loves us, then you'd think he wouldn't stand idly by and let us accidentally bumblefuck our way into eternal torment.
I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset, really, of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. Animal pain is bad. Not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen.
I can't actually fathom a scenario in which an all-powerful and all-loving God would let any bad stuff happen. The only conceivable reason why an all-loving entity would allow anything bad at all to happen is if both A, that bad stuff achieved an end that was good enough to make up for the bad stuff, and also B, that entity did not have the power to achieve that end without allowing that bad stuff. Even if the bad stuff achieves an end that is good enough to make up for it, an all-loving and all-powerful being would still not allow that bad stuff because he would have the power to achieve that end without allowing the bad stuff.
Like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue.
Why would allowing us to grow in virtue be preferable to being made perfectly virtuous from birth? Obviously, God himself did not grow in virtue. It's not like God had to overcome any vices. So growing in virtue can't be that great. If being perfectly virtuous from the beginning rather than growing in virtue is good enough for God, then it's good enough for me.
Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it.
No, there is no bad stuff that an all-powerful and all-loving being would allow pretty much by definition.
Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, here's this circle. He could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff?
He's all-powerful. That means he has the power to achieve any end he wants without allowing any bad stuff at all. It means that there is literally no reason that he must allow any bad stuff whatsoever.
And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others.
Given that the risk of that epistemic distance is that some people may end up suffering eternal torment, I really don't see how sharing the existence of God with others makes such a risk worth allowing. And what end does the good of sharing the existence of God with others accomplish that this supposedly all-powerful being does not have the power to accomplish without it?
For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to the divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom.
First of all, why is free will worth the risk of eternal damnation? And secondly, does God himself not have moral and cognitive freedom? If God has moral and cognitive freedom, but still plainly perceives his own existence and abstains from doing anything wrong, then why couldn't he have created us to also have moral and cognitive freedom while also plainly perceiving his existence and never doing anything wrong? And if God does not have moral and cognitive freedom, then why should I want it? If having no moral or cognitive freedom is good enough for God, why wouldn't it be good enough for me?
And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign, I'm kind of skeptical that that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real.
That depends on what you mean by conscious self and exists. A common misconception is that eliminative materialists don't believe that conscious experiences occur, which is clearly nonsense. That's not what they mean. When I say that the conscious self does not exist, what I mean is that consciousness is not an entity which exists, but rather an event which occurs.
So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it is to make it simple, is that, look, if we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things, who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Again, the reasons that he has for allowing bad things, in order to justify allowing those bad things, would have to be both good enough to make up for allowing them, and this supposedly all-powerful God would have to lack the power to achieve those reasons without allowing those bad things.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist, and the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in a situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in.
Exactly. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.